The Indigo Discrepancy. Chapter 1. The Room at Lincoln's Inn. The oak-paneled conference room at the Lincoln's Inn Fields law firm reeked of old money, the scent of beeswax wood polish, the leather of Chesterfield armchairs, and the faint aroma of Cohiba cigars that had seeped into the carpets decades ago. Outside the stained-glass windows, the quintessential London rain tapped a steady rhythm. The air inside was so still I could clearly hear the rustle of silk from Lady Caroline's designer dress as she shifted. She slid a yellowed parchment across the table toward me. The movement was slow, seamless, accompanied by a perfectly polite smile that didn't disturb a single wrinkle around the corners of her eyes. "Dearest Eleanor," her voice rang out, smooth as velvet yet carrying the weight of a command. "With just your expert signature in the bottom right corner, the Sterling family will avoid an unnecessary media scandal. Going to probate court would only serve as fodder for the tabloid press. And of course," she paused slightly, her gaze sweeping over me as if appraising a clearance item, "your mother's letters will be returned to their rightful place. Quite fair, isn't it?" Around the long table, 5 senior solicitors in bespoke 3-piece suits from Seville Row sat in silence, arms crossed, their eyes fixed on me. A polite coercion. A bloodless execution. According to their script, I was supposed to tremble. I, the illegitimate daughter of Lord Sterling and a barmaid from the working-class East End, was supposed to obediently bow my head before these aristocratic names and legal titles. I slowly reached out and picked up the parchment. Its surface was bone-dry. I switched on the green-glass brass banker's lamp, holding the document at a 45-degree angle under the cold light. To the naked eye, others would only see a codicil, a will supplement, stripping away my meager inheritance while transferring the control of my father's charitable foundation to Victoria, my half-sister currently filing her nails on the other side of the table. At the bottom was Lord Sterling's signature. A flamboyant, decisive stroke. But my eyes saw something else. I saw the discrepant sheen of the ink. I saw how the liquid sat idly on the surface of the paper fibers rather than biting deep into them. Victoria sighed, a deliberately loud breath meant to break the silence. "Just sign it, Eleanor. Don't make things awkward. You owe the family this much after everything my mother has tolerated for you." My fingers gently traced the edge of the paper. I wasn't angry. I didn't feel humiliated. The only thing reigning in my chest right now was an icy lucidity. They thought I was cornered. They thought the bait of my mother's keepsakes was enough to make me turn a blind eye to my expertise. But they didn't know that the very thing they were asking me to authenticate was the final nail in the coffin of their pride. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where it all began, so you can understand why I am sitting here and why my silence is not a surrender. Chapter 2. The Stain from the East End. I was born without the Sterling surname. On my birth certificate, the father's name was left blank. My mother, a woman with a radiant smile but eyes that were always tired, worked 6 days a week behind the bar of a raucous pub in the East End. She never spoke of my father with resentment. She only said he was a man from another world, a world that people like her and me could only gaze at through iron gates. When I was 12, my mother died of pneumonia. Just 3 days after her modest funeral, a gleaming black Rolls-Royce pulled up in front of my cramped flat. That was the first time I met Lord Sterling, my father. And it was also the day I was uprooted from my familiar world and thrown into Sterling Manor, a colossal grey stone estate nestled amid the lush green hills of Oxfordshire. My presence at Sterling Manor was a reluctant concession, a moral obligation my father had to fulfill to avoid the scrutiny of his peers. But to Lady Caroline, his legitimate wife, I was a dirty stain on the drawing room's hand-woven Aubusson rug. She never yelled at me. The British upper class doesn't scream. They murder your self-esteem with stabs wrapped in silk and velvet. I remember my first dinner there. I fumbled before the meticulously aligned rows of silver forks, knives, and spoons. I used the salad fork to spear a piece of beef. The clinking of cutlery in Lady Caroline's hands ceased. The room fell dead silent. She placed her linen napkin on her lap, smiling as she looked at me with the eyes one reserves for a strange creature. "Oh, Eleanor, how delightfully feral your grip on that fork is," she chimed smoothly, then turned to the butler. "Giles, fetch the girl another fork." Perhaps in the East End they cannot distinguish the differences between courses. Victoria, only 9 at the time, giggled. My father, seated at the head of the table, merely cleared his throat and resumed reading the Times. He did not defend me. That was the first lesson I learned. In this house, harmony mattered more than truth, and saving face mattered more than the hurt of a child. Throughout my teenage years, I tried. I learned how to walk without making a sound. I learned how to distinguish wines. I got straight A's in every subject, becoming the valedictorian of my boarding school. I thought that if I was simply good enough, well-behaved enough, they would recognize me as a member of the family. But their rules of the game were not based on merit. When I was 16, Victoria stole Lady Caroline's pearl necklace for a party and lost it. When it was discovered, Victoria sobbed and pointed her finger at me. "It was Eleanor. I saw her rummaging through your room." I stood there, waiting for my father to demand proof, some semblance of fair arbitration. But Lady Caroline merely sighed, walked over, and patted my shoulder. "Don't blame little Victoria. She carries pure-blood sterling veins, making her nerves rather sensitive around strangers. She frightens easily. As for you, Eleanor, family must protect one another. You owe the family that much, since we gave you a home. Just this once, take the blame. Don't act superior and don't make things awkward." I stayed silent. I took the fall for stealing fruit from the garden, even though my hands were free of sap. I gradually turned into a shadow, a sponge meant to absorb every mistake, every frustration of the Sterling family. I once believed my endurance would earn me a shred of familial love. Until I realized that, to them, my forbearance wasn't a sacrifice, it was the expected duty of an inferior. At 18, I left Stirling Manor for London to attend university. I took nothing with me except my mother's handwritten letters. But on the day I moved out, Lady Caroline quietly kept the oak box containing those letters behind. As a hostage, I overheard her joke to her friends during an afternoon tea party. One day, the girl will need to be reminded who holds her past. Chapter 3. The Sanctuary of Science. Today, I am no longer that bewildered little girl staring at silver forks. I am Eleanor Vance, 34 years old, an independent partner for Scotland Yard and major law firms across London. My profession? Forensic Document Examiner, FD. My lab sits on the top floor of a red brick building in Bloomsbury. It is quiet, sterile, and strictly climate-controlled. Unlike the drawing room at Stirling Manor, where every word carried 2 or 3 layers of meaning, this place operates solely on the absolute laws of physics and chemistry. Paper and ink do not lie. They do not know how to gaslight. They do not care whether you are a duke or a homeless vagrant. One morning a few months ago, the pale London sunlight filtered through the blinds, painting perfectly straight lines across my stainless steel workbench. I pulled open the second drawer from the top. Inside, resting carefully on black velvet, lay the only keepsake my father had ever secretly given me on my 18th birthday, right before I left. An antique bespoke Parker duofold fountain pen with an 18K gold nib, alongside a hexagonal glass ink bottle. I unscrewed the cap. The acrid scent of iron and the faint tartness of acid wafted up. This wasn't the sort of ink you bought at stationery stores. This was iron gall ink, oak gall ink, custom blended at a discreet artisan workshop in Soho. Lord Stirling was an extreme traditionalist. He refused to use ballpoint pens or industrial ink for any legal documents. "Ink is the blood of a promise," he once told me. I took a pipette, drew a tiny drop of ink, and placed it on a test scrap of parchment, then slid it under a stereo microscope. At high magnification, science began to tell its story. Iron gall ink possesses an inimitable chemical property. When freshly applied to paper, it is a pale blue. But upon exposure to airborne oxygen, the iron, too, sulfate and gallic acid react, slowly darkening into a deep black or purplish brown. Furthermore, its acidity ensures the strokes don't just sit on the surface, but slightly corrode, biting deep into the cellulose fibers of the paper. If you run your finger over an old iron gall signature, you can feel its subtle indentation. It locks into the paper like a scar of time. That was my father's DNA signature. A natural security lock impossible to forge through conventional printing or copying techniques. I capped the ink bottle, the sharp metallic click echoing in the quiet lab. This expertise had sustained me, defined me, and forged a solid defensive perimeter against the chaotic world outside. In this room, I had power. I was the one who delivered the final verdict before the High Court. If I said a contract was forged, millions of pounds would change hands. If I proved a signature was coerced, a fraudster would go to prison. I didn't need the Sterling family. I had built my own kingdom, born out of their very rejection. Until the phone on my desk rang. The screen displayed an internal extension from the office of Mr. Harrington, the Sterling family's private solicitor. My father had just died after 2 years bedridden by a severe illness. And Lady Caroline, after 16 years of cold indifference, without a single check-in, suddenly wanted to invite me to dinner. The invitation was delivered via a formal email, selecting a 3-star Michelin restaurant in the affluent district of Mayfair. "Come to a reconciliation dinner, Eleanor," she wrote. "It is time we put the past behind us. Family must protect one another." I stared at the words on the screen. The toxic incantation of the past had resurfaced. The lab suddenly felt a fraction colder. A dinner invitation in Mayfair is never simply about the food. It is a chessboard. And I knew this particular game of chess was tied to the will my father had left behind. Chapter 4: A Scheming Welcome Dinner. Lord Sterling's funeral took place at the family's private chapel in Oxfordshire, beneath a slate-gray sky and expensive black umbrellas. I stood in the third row, a position calculatedly arranged by the funeral directors, close enough for the press to see that the Sterlings did not abandon their flesh and blood, yet far enough so no one would confuse me with the official members standing right next to the memorial podium. Following my father's passing, by law, I was to receive a modest cash sum and the management rights to a small educational trust he had established years ago. My plan was crystal clear: finalize the legal formalities, collect my share, and permanently close the door on Sterling Manor. But 3 weeks after the funeral, Lady Caroline's dinner invitation appeared in my inbox. The restaurant was tucked away on a quiet street in Mayfair, boasting 3 Michelin stars and a 6-month waiting list. As I stepped inside, the soft golden glow from crystal chandeliers reflected off antiqued mirrors. There was no loud music, only the polite murmurs of London's elite and the occasional faint clinking of silverware against porcelain. Lady Caroline and Victoria were already seated at a corner table, offering a commanding view of the room while maintaining absolute privacy. Caroline wore an impeccably tailored black silk dress, a simple yet exorbitant pearl necklace gleaming at her throat. Victoria was scrolling through her phone, looking profoundly bored. Eleanor, punctual as always, Caroline smiled as the waiter pulled out my chair. Her smile never reached her eyes. I sat down, placing my handbag aside. "Lady Caroline." "Victoria." "Oh, come now, we are family," Caroline gently chided, pushing a menu toward me. "I've already ordered. The head chef here is an old friend of the family. He has prepared a special tasting menu for us tonight." The moment the appetizer was served, I immediately understood what made it so special. Beneath the silver cloche lay a portion of butter-poached Brittany blue lobster, sprinkled with beluga caviar. The rich aroma of premium seafood wafted into the air. I stared at the plate. When I was 13, during a garden party at Sterling Manor, I had to be airlifted to the hospital due to anaphylactic shock after accidentally eating a canopy containing lobster. Caroline was the one in the kitchen supervising the menu that day. She knew perfectly well. "Oh, look at me." Caroline brought a hand to her mouth, her face a mask of theatrical dismay. "I completely forgot. You EastEnders aren't accustomed to digesting high-end seafood, are you? I simply assumed that after all these years living in London, your stomach would have adapted." Victoria gave a soft sneer, twirling a piece of lobster meat onto her fork and raising it to her lips. "If you can't eat it, just order a salad. Don't make things awkward." I wasn't angry. I merely beckoned the waiter over with quiet composure, asking him to clear the plate and replace it with a glass of sparkling mineral water. I sat there, my hands clasped on the table, watching them savor the meal. Upper-class cruelty is always served with a smile and feigned thoughtlessness. Once the main course concluded, Caroline took a sip of Chablis, gently dabbing the corners of her mouth. The real play was about to begin. Now, Eleanor, her voice dropped, carrying a calculated exhaustion. You know, your father's passing has left a massive void, both emotionally and financially. Victoria stopped eating, playing along with tear-welled eyes. The maintenance costs for Sterling Manor are spiraling out of control. The inheritance tax the government slapped on the estate has practically drained our cash flow. You have no idea how much pressure Mother and I have been shouldering these past few days. I looked straight at Victoria. The family trust holds tens of millions of pounds. Selling a few Renaissance paintings in the library or the flat in Monaco would be more than enough to cover the tax. Caroline sighed, setting her wine glass down with a soft clink. That is the family's legacy, Eleanor. We cannot sell our legacy to pay off debts. It would break your father's heart. She leaned toward me, dropping her voice to a whisper. I know that in his will, your father left you the management of the educational trust. It isn't much compared to the total estate, but the cash sum attached to it, it is crucial right now to uphold the honor of the Sterling name. Mother is asking you to sign the trust over to us, Victoria interjected, losing her patience. Family must protect one another, Eleanor. You owe the family this. The room seemed to fall still. The demand had been laid on the table, naked and brazen beneath the crystal lights. I looked at the two women before me. They were wearing outfits worth thousands of pounds, sitting in the most expensive restaurant in London, and were demanding that the illegitimate daughter surrender her final shred of lawful inheritance just so they wouldn't have to part with a superfluous painting. I will manage the educational trust exactly according to Lord Sterling's wishes, I replied, my voice completely flat and rippleless. It is a charitable foundation, not a slush fund to pay for the landscaping at the manor. Thank you for dinner, my lady. I stood up, offered a nod of farewell, and walked out of the restaurant. As the glass door closed behind me, I knew the real war had only just begun. They would never let me walk away with a single thing bearing the Sterling name. Chapter 5. The Trap is Set. 3 days after the dinner in Mayfair, my office received a call from Mr. Harrington, senior partner at Harrington, Finch and Partners, the man who had served the Sterling family for 3 decades. Miss Vance, there is a new development regarding the Earl's will. Please arrange some time to come to our office this afternoon. His voice over the phone was taut, carrying the tone of a summons rather than a negotiation. That was the very moment I described at the beginning of the story. The oak-paneled conference room. The sound of rain falling outside the window. The suffocating silence of the 3-piece suits. When I sat down in the leather armchair opposite Harrington, Lady Caroline and Victoria were already there. The atmosphere in the room was entirely different from the dinner in Mayfair. The faint softness was gone. Here, amidst walls lined with law books, they carried the demeanor of executioners. Mr. Harrington cleared his throat and opened a burgundy leather portfolio. Miss Vance, 2 days ago, while clearing out Lord Sterling's private library, Lady Caroline stumbled upon a document hidden beneath the bottom lining of a desk drawer. He carefully slid out a piece of parchment and laid it on the table. This is a codicil, a will supplement. It was drafted and signed on November 12, 2020. I did not touch the paper. I let Harrington continue. The contents of this codicil alter the original will we publicized. The Earl explicitly states that, recognizing the need to consolidate resources to protect the family's pure-blood legacy during difficult times, all of your entitlements, including the cash sum and the management of the educational trust, will be transferred to Miss Victoria. Victoria smirked, a supremely satisfied half-smile. However, Harrington continued, clasping his hands together. This document is handwritten and lacks the signature of a second witness. Under normal circumstances, we would have to submit it to the probate court to request validation of its enforceability. And if it goes to court, Lady Caroline interjected, her silky voice slicing through the sound of the rain. The tabloid press will catch wind of it. They'll drudge up your origins again, Eleanor. That moniker, the bastard from the East End, will be plastered across the front pages of the Sun. Your father has only just been laid to rest. He does not deserve to be made a laughingstock." I remained silent. My gaze swept from the paper to Caroline's face. The trap was springing open. "But there is a more elegant solution." Harrington pushed the paper toward me, accompanied by a pen. "Ms. Vance, you are a reputable forensic document examiner. The court consistently accepts your independent expert reports. If you, in your professional capacity, sign an affidavit authenticating that the signature on this codicil truly belongs to Lord Sterling, the court will approve it immediately without a hearing." He paused, letting the weight of the proposition sink into the air. That was when Caroline played her ace. She slowly opened her Hermes handbag and retrieved a small, aged oak box. The very box she had confiscated from me on the day I moved out at 18. "Look here," Caroline said, her tone like a benevolent mother coaxing a stubborn child. "With just your expert signature here, the Sterling family will avoid a media scandal. And of course, your mother's letters will be returned to their rightful place. Quite fair, isn't it? They wanted me to use my professional integrity, the only thing I had built with my own hands, to legitimize their theft of my inheritance. They were forcing me to choose, either defend the truth and be dragged into a filthy legal war in the press, or compromise, crossing my own name out of my father's legacy by my own hand, just to reclaim a few orphaned keepsakes." "Just this once, Eleanor," Caroline whispered. "Don't act superior. Do the right thing for the family." Chapter 6. An Expert's Scrutiny. The room fell silent. The lashing of the rain against the stained glass was distinctly audible. All eyes were pinned on me, waiting for my surrender. I slowly reached out, but not for the pen Harrington offered. I picked up the parchment. Its surface was bone-dry. Too dry. Natural parchment stored in a wooden desk drawer typically retains a certain amount of ambient moisture from the London air. But this paper was brittle beneath my fingers, a classic sign of being microwaved or baked under a heat lamp to create an artificial yellowed age. I switched on the banker's lamp at the corner of the table and brought the document closer to the light. "What the hell are you doing?" Victoria snapped, her impatience fracturing her aristocratic mask. "Stop being so pretentious. Father's handwriting is right there in plain sight. Do you think his legitimate wife and daughter wouldn't recognize it? But we need you to put on this little act." I didn't answer Victoria. I was busy analyzing the ink strokes. The morphology of the signature was indeed Lord Sterling's, the elongated S, the small loop in the T, the decisive cross-stroke. At a glance, it was a morphologically perfect replica. The forger had practiced extensively, likely tracing an old document using a lightbox. But the shape is merely the shell. The ink is the soul. Under the cold light of the lamp, the ink gave off a slightly glaring, glossy blue sheen. It sat entirely on top of the paper's surface. It didn't bite into the cellulose fibers at all. My father's iron gall ink was never glossy. It sank into the paper, micro-corroding it to produce a stubborn, deep black that was ruthless against the passage of time. Furthermore, in 2020, my father had already begun exhibiting the hand tremors of his neurodegenerative disease prior to his stroke. The hook of the signature was far too smooth, the pen pressure entirely consistent from start to finish, a telltale sign of a writer who was either overly confident or deliberately drawing the signature, rather than signing it with natural muscle memory. They thought my impoverished, subservient childhood had defined me. They thought I was just a bastard child desperate for their charity. But they forgot that I make my living stripping liars bare. I lowered the paper and turned off the desk lamp. "Mr. Harrington," I looked up at the lawyer. "You know my working principles. The naked eye and office lighting are not enough for a licensed Scotland Yard examiner to sign an authentication. I need a spectroscopic analysis." Harrington's expression shifted slightly. He glanced at Lady Caroline. "What do you mean?" Caroline narrowed her eyes, the smile on her lips freezing. I slowly slid the document back into the burgundy portfolio. "I will be taking this document back to my lab. I need exactly 24 hours to conduct chemical tests and compile an independent expert report following proper legal protocols. If you want my signature to hold weight before the probate court, it must be accompanied by my expert seal and a microanalysis dossier." Otherwise, the court will throw it out immediately. I looked straight into Caroline's eyes, my voice flat and icy. Does my lady want it done quickly, or does my lady want it done legally so no one can overturn it later? Caroline pursed her lips. She was an old fox, but she was completely blind to forensic science. She only saw a girl clinging to rigid procedures to salvage a final shred of dignity. In Caroline's mind, once I demanded to follow proper protocol, it meant I had agreed to sell myself out. I merely needed a plausible cover to deceive my own conscience. She gave Harrington a curt nod. Very well, the lawyer said, pushing an evidence chain of custody log toward me. Ms. Vance, you have 24 hours. Tomorrow afternoon, at 3 o'clock, we will reconvene here. Please understand, you are only permitted to conduct non-destructive testing. Of course, I nodded, quickly signing the log. I stood up, picked up the portfolio containing the forged codicil, and carefully placed it into my leather briefcase. My gaze flicked over the oak box holding my mother's letters, still resting on the table. Tomorrow, I will return with the report, I said, pushing my chair back and heading for the door. Keep that box safe, Lady Caroline. The truth always exacts a price. Chapter 7. Chromatography in the dark. London at night draped itself in a damp silence. Inside the Bloomsbury lab, the low hum of the ventilation system and the clicking of electronic equipment were the only music I needed. I deadbolt the door. The room temperature was set to the ideal standard, 20 degrees Celsius, 45% humidity. On the stainless steel workbench, the codicil lay motionless beneath the white fluorescent lights. It was like a patient awaiting surgery, all its secrets about to be dissected under the impassive eye of science. I put on my white lab coat and powder-free nitrile gloves. The first step is always spectroscopy. I place the document under the video spectral comparator, VSC. Beneath various wavelengths, from ultraviolet, UV, to infrared, IR, the hidden layers of the ink began to reveal themselves. Genuine iron gall ink, due to its high iron, 2, sulfate content, aggressively absorbs infrared light, rendering a deep, dense black on the scanner's monitor. But when I switched the VSC to infrared mode, Lord Stirling's signature on this codicil fluoresced faintly. It reflected the light instead of absorbing it. A faint smile grazed my lips. I was right. But spectroscopy is merely observation. The court requires absolute numbers and graphs. I moved on to the second step, thin layer chromatography, TLC. Using a hollow micropunch, I carefully extracted 3 paper samples no larger than the head of a pin. 1 sample from a blank area of the paper as a control. 1 from the body of the S. 1 from the final hook. I dropped the microsamples into tiny glass test tubes, adding pyridine solvent to dissolve the ink. The solution instantly turned a brilliant blue. If this were oak gall ink, it would never dissolve so easily. The acid layer would have oxidized tightly into the paper fibers for years. Using a micropipette, I spotted droplets of the solution onto a silica gel thin layer plate, then placed it into a chromatography development chamber. The solvent slowly moved up via capillary action, dragging the ink's components with it, separating them into distinct streaks of color like a stretched rainbow. 15 minutes later, the results appeared starkly under the UV light. No traces of iron. No evidence of gallic acid or any organic tanning compounds. Instead, the chromatogram displayed a distinct cyan band with an RF retention factor, resting at 0.65. I stripped off my gloves, walked over to my computer, and accessed the International Ink database linked with Interpol. I entered the spectral parameters. The system took less than 10 seconds to return a match. Synthetic pigment, copper phthalocyanine. This is an ultra-durable industrial pigment, widely used in automotive paints and, more recently, in the pen manufacturing industry. I further filtered the results by patent registration timelines. This spectral band and solvent composition matched with 99.9% accuracy the ink formula of a high-end Swiss gel pen. That specific pen line was patented and officially launched onto the global market in April 2021. I stared at the screen, the blue light washing over my face. The codicil was dated November 12, 2020. Lord Sterling had suffered a stroke, becoming hemiplegic and losing his grip strength by the end of 2020. He couldn't possibly have miraculously risen in 2021 to use a Swiss gel pen that hadn't yet been manufactured, signing a smooth, flamboyant signature just to strip away his daughter's inheritance. The forgers had been so meticulous in baking the parchment to fake its age, so masterful in tracing every curve of the signature. But they were deeply ignorant of chemistry. They thought any pen was a pen, and any blue-black ink was just ink. I didn't sleep that entire night. I sat at my computer, typing out every line of the report. A 20-page independent expert dossier. I attached everything. High-resolution microphotographs showing the ink sitting atop the paper fibers, the VSC spectral graphs, and the TLC chromatography comparison table from the Interpol database. The next morning, I printed the document, binding it neatly into a file. On the final page, I signed my name, noted my professional license number, and pressed my embossed red seal as an independent forensic examiner. It wasn't just a dossier. It was a verdict. Chapter 8. The stage is set for the climax. At exactly 3 o'clock in the afternoon, I pushed open the tempered glass door of Harrington, Finch and Partners at Lincoln's Inn Fields. The rain had not yet ceased, turning the London sky a dismal, oppressive gray. As the secretary led me to the oak-paneled conference room, I paused for a beat at the threshold. The room was significantly more crowded than yesterday. Lady Caroline had not only come with Victoria. She had invited 3 members of the Sterling family's board of trustees, along with 2 close aristocratic friends, the Earl of Hastings and his wife. They were seated around the long table, sipping Earl Grey tea from bone china cups. Polite, hushed laughter filled the air. The moment I walked in, everyone stopped simultaneously and turned their eyes toward me. Caroline had deliberately arranged a public stage. She wanted to use the pressure of the crowd, representatives of the power, prestige, and propriety of the upper class, to crush my last remaining urge to resist. She wanted to turn this signing into a smooth and lawful handover before undeniable witnesses. Eleanor, darling, Caroline stood up, offering a theatrical, benevolent smile. She stepped forward, opening her arms as if to embrace me, but I politely took a step back to place my rain-splattered leather briefcase onto an empty chair. Her hands froze midair before quickly retracting to pat my shoulder lightly. "I'm so glad you're on time. Lord Hastings and the trustees happened to drop by to discuss the arrangements for your father's memorial, so I invited them to stay and witness today's signing. Everything should be transparent, don't you think?" "Transparency is always best, my lady," I replied, my tone neutral and devoid of emotion. I sat down in the chair opposite Harrington. The old lawyer was wiping his spectacles, looking slightly tense, but fighting to maintain a composed demeanor. He pulled the codicil from an envelope the secretary had just brought in and slid it toward me. "Miss Vance, 24 hours have passed," Harrington said, interlacing his fingers. "We hope your microanalysis has concluded and that the results are to your satisfaction." The eyes of all 8 people in the room bore into me. Glances of condescension, judgment, and curiosity. In their eyes, I was just the stubborn bastard child who would inevitably have to bow to the power of bloodlines and wealth. Caroline sat down next to Victoria and gently pushed the oak box containing my mother's letters forward, just enough so that it sat perfectly in my line of sight. A silent reminder. "Eleanor," Caroline's voice was soft, echoing in the wood-paneled room. "I know you're grieving. That educational trust was the one thing tethering you to him. But your father's dying wish was to protect the pure-blood legacy of this family during difficult times. Do the right thing. Your signature today is not a loss, but a return to your true, rightful place in this family." From her handbag, she produced a fountain pen, a gold-capped Mont Blanc, and slid it across the polished table toward me. The pen rolled to a stop right in front of me, its nib pointing directly at my chest. The stage was set. The actors were in position. Now they were only waiting for me to deliver the final line of the loser. Chapter 9. Weaponizing Silence. I looked at the pen. I looked at the parchment. And then I looked at the oak box. But I did not move. I did not pick up the pen, nor did I open my leather briefcase. I simply crossed my arms, leaned back into the Chesterfield chair, and stayed silent. 1 second. 2 seconds. 10 seconds passed. Initially, the stillness was just a polite pause, but as it stretched on, it began to siphon the oxygen out of the room. The clinking of teacups against saucers ceased entirely. Lord Hastings cleared his throat, glancing awkwardly at Harrington. Silence is a terrifying weapon. If you yell and curse, people have an excuse to call you crazy. If you weep, they will call you weak. But when you are absolutely silent, you force the other party to fill the void. And usually, under the tension and the desperate need to retain control, they will slip up. Lawyer Harrington tapped his fingers on the table and checked his watch. Miss Vance, we do not have all afternoon. The Board of Trustees needs this affidavit for tax processing tomorrow morning. Victoria rolled her eyes, her privileged arrogance sapping the last of her patience. She leaned forward, hissing in a whisper loud enough for the entire table to hear, "Just sign it, you bastard." How long are you going to keep up this act? Keep your last shred of dignity by obeying. My father's signature is right there in plain sight, or are your expert eyes as blind as your origins? Victoria, mind your language, Caroline reprimanded her daughter, though her tone carried a note of indulgence. She turned to me, her eyes as sharp as shattered glass. My silence was eroding Caroline's elegant facade. She believed I was hesitating, torn between my pride and my mother's keepsakes. And, like every arrogant person who genuinely believes they author the rules of the game, she decided to deliver the killing blow, a statement designed to obliterate any lingering doubts among the aristocratic guests seated around the table. Eleanor, Caroline enunciated every word, her volume rising higher than usual to capture the attention of the entire room. If you still harbor doubts about the authenticity of this document, then let me tell you something. I saw with my own eyes your father write and sign this codicil himself. The room fell dead silent. I blinked. The hook had been dropped. Assuming I was shocked, Caroline pressed her advantage, weaving in fabricated details to bolster her lie's authenticity. It was late evening in the library, she recounted, her eyes misting over with flawless theatricality. He looked so tired. I saw him take out the paper and use his absolute favorite pen, that antique bespoke Parker Dufold he never let anyone else touch. He signed it the very night before he fell ill and was bedridden. So, please, do not insult my memory and the Earl's dying wish with your unreasonable stubbornness. I exhaled, a soft sigh of relief, ruthless and deeply satisfied. She had no idea she had just wrapped a noose around her own neck and kicked the chair out from under her. She should have stayed quiet. If she had claimed she knew nothing about the paper's origins, she could have blamed it on a butler or some deceased former lawyer. But her pride and her burning desire to humiliate me in front of an audience had caused her to blurt out a fatal lie. A perjury nailed to the wall in front of 5 senior solicitors and the executive board of trustees. I slowly reached out and picked up the gold-plated Montblanc pen from the table. Victoria smirked, leaning back in her chair triumphantly. Caroline let out a soft sigh, her eyes glinting with supreme contempt. But I didn't uncap the pen. I used the back end of the pen to tap the forged parchment 3 times. Tap, tap, tap. The dry, hollow sound echoed in the quiet room. Lady Caroline, I spoke up. My tone was entirely placid, without a single ripple of anger. You just stated that you saw Lord Sterling use the bespoke Parker Dufold to sign this document with your own eyes? I did. Caroline tilted her chin up. Before God and everyone present. I smiled. A smile that had never been so cold. Excellent. I dropped the Montblanc pen, letting it clatter across the table. I reached down and unclasped my leather briefcase. Then, ladies and gentlemen, we have a very fascinating chemical anomaly to discuss. Chapter 10. The Reversal, the Color of Truth. The brass locks of the briefcase sprang open with a crisp click. From inside, I carefully extracted a 20-page dossier, bound perfectly flat with thermal glue. On the right edge of the cover page sat the embossed red seal of an independent forensic examiner, alongside my signature and my official Scotland Yard license number. I placed the dossier on the table and slid it toward the center, stopping it right next to the forged codicil. The thud of the paper hitting the oak would sounded exactly like a judge's gavel striking the sounding block. Ladies and gentlemen, I addressed the room, my volume moderate but enunciating every syllable. In my capacity as Forensic Document Examiner number 8402, I am issuing formal notice. This report, along with all microsamples and spectral evidence, will be submitted directly to the Scotland Yard Fraud Investigation Division and the Probate Court at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. I paused for a beat, sweeping my gaze over the faces around the table, which were beginning to freeze over. This document is a forgery. It was as if the air had been violently sucked from the room. For a fraction of a second, the silence was so thick I could hear the rustle of silk lining as Lord Hastings flinched and shifted in his seat. "What the hell are you saying?" Victoria shrieked, springing to her feet and slamming her hands on the table. "Are you insane? You dare slander." "Victoria, sit down," Harrington cut her off. His voice had lost its earlier condescension, replaced by the razor-sharp coldness of a legal professional who had just caught the scent of career-ending liability. He pulled my report toward him and opened the first page. "Mr. Harrington, please turn to page 7, I instructed calmly, leaning back into my chair, my hands interlaced on my lap. Harrington complied. What greeted his eyes, and the eyes of those seated near him, was a high-resolution color print of a thin-layer chromatography (TLC) graph, complete with a cross-reference code from the Interpol database. The signature on this document was created using an ink containing a synthetic pigment called copper phthalocyanine, I explained, my voice as steady as if I were standing at the witness stand. This specific compound belongs to a high-end line of Swiss gel pens. This particular pen model was only patented and released to the global market in April 2021. I shifted my gaze to the orphaned codicil lying on the table. Meanwhile, this document is dated November 12, 2020. Unless the Earl possessed a time machine, he could not possibly have used an unmanufactured ink to sign his name. Impossible, Caroline cried out, her voice fracturing. She lunged forward, grabbing Harrington's suit lapel. It's a technical error. That brat is using garbage scientific jargon to trick us. She wants revenge. And one more thing, I continued, gently slicing through her panic. Lord Stirling was an extreme traditionalist. He strictly used oak gall ink, iron gall, for every important document. Iron gall ink is acidic. It corrodes the paper and leaves a fundamentally different spectral signature. The ink on this parchment sits entirely on top of the cellulose surface. A first-year forensic intern could spot the difference. I slowly turned my head, locking eyes directly with Caroline. Her expensive makeup seemed to sag under the weight of gravity, laying bare her extreme age and sheer terror. But the most fascinating part isn't the chemistry of the ink, my lady, I said, pushing the words toward her like calculated throwing knives. It is your phenomenal memory. You just confirmed, before 5 senior solicitors, 3 trustees, and Lord Hastings, that you saw Lord Stirling sign this paper with his Parker duofold. You were absolutely certain of that, weren't you? Caroline's lips trembled. She opened her mouth, but no sound escaped. She finally realized the depth of the trap her own arrogance had dug. Under the Fraud Act 2006 of the United Kingdom, I turned back to Harrington, who now had beads of sweat forming on his forehead. The act of committing perjury to legitimize a forged document for financial gain is a felony. The maximum penalty is 10 years in prison. Harrington immediately let go of the codicil as if it had burst into flames. He pushed his chair back. The survival instincts of a veteran lawyer had kicked in. He could not be implicated in a blatant forgery inside his own firm. The chemical evidence was absolute. If he tried to protect Caroline now, his 30-year license would vanish overnight. But... Victoria stammered, her face ashen, staring wildly from her mother to Harrington. It's just an educational trust. We'll just give it back to her. There's no need for court. We withdraw the codicil. It is entirely too late for that, Miss Victoria, a deep, gravelly voice echoed from the end of the table. It was Lord Hastings. The polite, social respect in his eyes had evaporated, replaced by a mixture of disgust and sheer astonishment. This document has already been formally presented before the Board of Trustees and the representing legal counsel. Harrington took off his glasses, dabbing his sweaty forehead with a handkerchief. His hands were trembling slightly. "Mr. Harrington," I called out softly. "If I recall correctly, the original will drafted and stored by your firm contains an exceptionally strict protective clause, doesn't it?" Harrington swallowed hard. He nodded slowly, his voice hoarse. "The forfeiture clause. Could you explain to my lady and Miss Victoria what that clause means?" I asked. The lawyer cleared his throat, unable to look Caroline in the eye. "Under that clause, any beneficiary who engages in fraud, document forgery, or unlawful interference in an attempt to alter the Earl's intended distribution of assets will automatically forfeit their entire right of inheritance to the family estate." It was as if the room had been dropped into a glacial crevasse. The pride, Stirling Manor, the Renaissance paintings, tens of millions of pounds in the trust fund, the bank accounts in Monaco, everything. Just because they couldn't stand to see me walk away with a meager, legally designated fraction of the estate, they had burned their own empire to the ground. They had dug their own grave. It was a brutally unforgiving application of poetic justice by the law. "You're lying," Caroline screamed, a ragged, desperate shriek that tore through the elegant shell she had maintained for decades. She shot up from her chair, pointing a shaking finger in Harrington's face. "You are my lawyer. You have to protect us. She's a bastard. She's making it all up. What the hell is a gel pen? It's just a stroke of ink." "That stroke of ink has ended everything, Lady Caroline," I replied, calmly snapping the lid of my briefcase shut. The metallic click sounded like a final period. I stood up and adjusted the lapels of my blazer. I didn't need to scream at them. I didn't need to hurl the trauma of my teenage years at Stirling Manor into their faces. The numbers, the spectral bands, and the emotionless legal clauses were doing all of that for me. The truth does not need to raise its voice. It inherently possesses the power to crush every lie. Chapter 11. The Aftermath, the Fall of the Empire. I remained seated in the leather Chesterfield armchair, my back straight, my hands resting quietly on the table. Meanwhile, the world around Lady Caroline and Victoria was crumbling to pieces at the speed of an avalanche. The silence following my final words did not last long. It was torn apart by the awkward, dry cough of Lord Hastings. He stood up, shoving his chair back aggressively, creating a grating scrape against the oak floorboards. As a senior member of the Stirling Trust Board, Hastings' voice had lost the social languor of the aristocracy. It was forged like cold steel. "I hereby announce the immediate suspension of Miss Victoria's financial access to all trust accounts. Any scheduled disbursements for tomorrow morning are frozen." "Lord Hastings, you can't do that." Victoria sprang to her feet in panic, her Christian Louboutin heels stamping hard into the carpet. "That is my money. That is my family's trust." "It was your trust, Miss Victoria," another solicitor on the board replied coldly. "Under the forfeiture clause, from the exact moment this forged document was formally submitted in this room, your and Lady Caroline's inheritance rights were nullified." "But we haven't submitted it to court yet," Caroline shrieked, her exquisite makeup now smudged with sweat. She whipped around to Harrington, gripping the edge of the table like a drowning woman clutching a lifebuoy. "Harrington, didn't you say we only needed an internal authentication? Tear it up. Destroy the document. No one will know. We'll revert to the old will, and Eleanor can still take her pathetic educational trust." Harrington looked at her as if she were an infectious pathogen. With an astonishing decisiveness for his age, the old lawyer reached for the forged codicil and shoved it straight into a transparent plastic evidence bag bearing the law firm's logo. "Lady Caroline," Harrington said, his voice trembling but articulating every word to ensure everyone in the room heard his absolution. "This document is on the record. As a solicitor regulated by the Solicitors Regulation Authority, SRA, I have a legal obligation to report any fraudulent activity occurring within my firm. If I tore it up, I would become an accomplice to perverting the course of justice and destroying evidence." He took a deep breath, smoothing his suit jacket. "Harrington, Finch and Partners officially terminates its legal representation of you and Miss Victoria, effective immediately. I advise you both to seek a criminal defense attorney. Right now. You treacherous bastard. Caroline hissed. Her arm swung out, violently sweeping the bone china teacup of Earl Grey off the table. Crash. The expensive cup shattered. The amber-brown tea splashed everywhere, soaking Victoria's silk dress and spilling over the oak box holding my mother's letters. That was the moment the mask of the pure-blood elite entirely slipped. No more feigned benevolence, no more velvet-wrapped sarcasm. In this centuries-old wood-paneled room, before the aristocratic friends she had painstakingly invited to assert her dominance, Lady Caroline looked pathetic, deranged, and stripped bare. And when backed into a corner, toxic people will always do what they do best, turn and tear each other apart. This is all your fault. Caroline suddenly rounded on Victoria, pointing a 2-carat diamond-ringed finger directly in her daughter's face. I told you to find his old pen. I told you to use black ink. Why the hell did you use that goddamn Swiss gel pen? The entire room was stunned. Even I had to blink. In her sheer panic, Caroline had hammered the final nail into their legal coffin with an unequivocally clear confession. You're blaming me? Victoria's eyes bulged, tears blurring her expensive mascara, running black streaks down her cheeks. You were the one who traced the signature on the lightbox. You were the one who said all ink is the same, as long as it's blue-black. I told you not to mess with Eleanor, she's Scotland Yard's bloodhound, but you insisted on dragging her here to humiliate her. Shut your mouth, you idiot. Caroline slapped the air with a thunderous strike, grazing Victoria's shoulder. You're the idiot. You just lost us Sterling Manor. We're bankrupt. Victoria wailed, burying her face in her hands and collapsing into the chair beside her. Arguments, curses, and blame echoed off the law-book-lined walls. Lord Hastings squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head in dismay, before turning his back and walking straight toward the door. The other trustees quietly grabbed their coats and slipped away, fleeing as if escaping a burning house. They didn't want their names associated with this quagmire for a second longer. I sat there, in the eye of the storm, entirely detached from their chaos. I had once thought that the day I exposed their cruelty, I would feel an overwhelming sense of gloating. I imagined standing up, screaming in their faces about the leftover food, the insults, the salad fork when I was 13, and how they called my mother's flesh and blood a stain. But right now, watching two women in designer clothes screaming and tearing at each other amidst shattered porcelain and scrap paper, I felt no triumph. Nor did I feel any sorrow. In my chest, there was only a quiet void, as flat and still as a frozen lake. They were so small. Their evil was neither grand nor worthy of an ancient dynasty. It was merely petty greed, ignorance cloaked in tea parties, and weakness disguised as arrogance. I slowly reached out and picked up my mother's oak box. The tea had dampened a bottom corner, but the inside remained dry. I carefully wiped it clean with my handkerchief, then placed it in my briefcase. Harrington was on the phone with someone, likely the police or the firm's managing partner, his voice urgent and clipped. Victoria was still sobbing, her makeup ruined. Caroline slumped in her chair, clutching her head, muttering nonsense, her eyes glazed over as she stared at the spectral graph I had left on the table. I zipped my briefcase. The dry screech of the metal cut through Victoria's sobs. I opened my wallet, pulled out a small white envelope I had prepared at home, and placed it exactly where the forged codicil used to be. What is this? Caroline looked up, her bloodshot, vacant eyes staring at the envelope as if it were another bomb. A cash check for £450, my lady, I replied, putting on my trench coat. To cover the cost of the Brittany lobster and the glass of Chablis that I did not consume at the Mayfair restaurant 4 days ago. Caroline's mouth fell open, speechless. I never let anyone pay for me. I looked straight into her eyes, my voice featherlight yet razor-sharp. And I certainly never shouldered debts for someone else's pride. Use that money to pay a fraction of your upcoming criminal defense retainer. My lady will need every penny. I picked up my briefcase, turned, and walked away. I did not look back. Not a single glance of pity, not a single smirk. I left behind the oak-paneled room, left behind the decaying aristocratic names, and left behind the bastard moniker they had tried so hard to bind to my life. As the heavy conference room door clicked shut behind me, Caroline's cursing and Victoria's wailing were instantly severed, buried inside. The law firm's corridor was strangely quiet. The yellow light spilled onto the thick wool carpet, swallowing all footsteps. I took a deep breath. The air out in the hallway no longer smelled of stale leather or suffocating cigars. It smelled of the London rain, a scent that was cold, clean, and entirely free. Chapter 12. Healing the New Boundary. 6 months later. London welcomed me with a sun-drenched spring morning. Honey-pale rays pierced through the blinds of my Bloomsbury lab, painting straight, warm lines across the stainless steel workbench. No rhythmic, looming rain, no stale cigar smoke or suffocating air steeped in family machinations. Here, right now, there was only the soft hum of the air purifier and the aroma of freshly roasted coffee rising from the ceramic mug next to my computer. My iPad screen lit up with a notification from the Telegraph app. The headline appeared in the right corner. Sterling Empire collapses. Lady Caroline receives suspended sentence. Historic Sterling Manor foreclosed by bank. I took a sip of coffee, skimming over the summary lines. After that afternoon at Harrington's law firm, a domino effect had wiped out everything they once took pride in. Without my signature to cover up the incident, and under the pressure of Scotland Yard's investigation stemming from the evidence I submitted, Lady Caroline had to plead guilty to perjury and fraud in exchange for a 2-year suspended sentence, avoiding prison time in her 60s. Victoria, stripped of her entire inheritance under the original will's clause, had to move out of her luxury Monaco apartment and was currently entangled in a lawsuit, fighting her own mother over the last remaining scraps of personal assets. The bank had foreclosed on Sterling Manor to settle the massive inheritance tax and legal fees. The estate that was once a symbol of pure-blood supremacy and power, where I used to tiptoe like a shadow, was now waiting to be bought by some American tech billionaire. I swiped the screen, closing the app. I didn't smile. I didn't feel gloating, nor did I feel a hint of pity. Those people, that name, that manor, all of it had washed out of my life like cheap watercolor ink smearing in the rain. A boundary had been drawn, and it was permanent. I wasn't leaving the Sterling family. I was simply refusing to continue playing the victim in their theatrical play. I set my coffee mug down and pulled open the second drawer of my desk. Inside was my mother's small oak box. Its bottom corner still bore a faded stain from the spilled Earl Grey tea 6 months ago, but the core inside was perfectly intact. The police had returned it to me after concluding their evidence collection at the law firm, accompanied by a formal letter of apology from Mr. Harrington's office for the unfortunate incident. I carefully opened the lid. The scent of old paper and dried lavender faintly wafted up. I pulled out a letter, tracing my mother's rounded, slightly messy handwriting. It wasn't the flamboyant, stylized script of the upper class, nor was it written on expensive parchment, but it was genuine. She wrote about her days working until her legs ached at the bar, about saving enough money to buy me a new dress for my birthday, about how proud she was when my teacher praised my math skills. Not a single word of resentment toward fate, no bitterness, only the unconditional love of a great woman from the East End. I placed my mother's letter next to the microscope, then gently lifted my father's antique bespoke Parker Duofold fountain pen and the hexagonal bottle of iron gall ink from the black velvet. He had never publicly defended me, but he had instilled in me an absolute respect for paper and ink, for the things preserved through time. I would not throw away this part of my legacy. I didn't need to erase the sterling blood in my veins to prove my independence. I would keep the best of both worlds, my mother's love and my father's sharpness and discipline. I unscrewed the cap of the ink bottle, the familiar metallic click ringing out. The acrid scent of iron and oak gall acid filled the air. I drew a little ink into the Parker Duofold and opened my leather-bound journal. I began to write my entry for today. The 18K gold nib glided smoothly across the paper. The ink flowing out initially bore a sharp blue hue. I paused, sitting quietly to watch it. Only seconds later, Reacting with the oxygen in the room, that blue slowly bit deep into the paper fibers, shifting into a deep, stubborn, eternal black. Inerasable. Unforgeable. The truth was settled. The war was over. I closed the journal and looked out at the brilliant blue London sky through the window. The emptiness in my chest over the past 16 years was now filled with absolute peace. I no longer needed any of them to acknowledge me. I didn't need to be perfect to be loved by them, nor did I need to bow my head to preserve their so-called family harmony. They had once trapped me in their silence, forcing me to believe I was just a shadow from the East End. But they forgot one thing: handwriting can be forged, people can lie, but the truth always speaks for itself if you only know how to listen.